45 minutes, we are going to provide a quick review of PDSA cycles. We're going to share some tips that you can use to strengthen your PDSAs. We'll also introduce you to a tool that can help you to assess some key components of a PDSA. And then we're going to stop and practice throughout. So we're going to be asking you to weigh in quite a bit through the chat. We have a lot of people on the line, but we want everyone to be able to participate, and we'll use that to check our learning throughout the session today. So back in learning session 1, we introduced you to the model for improvement and PDSAs. So you might remember trying out those different techniques to get a coin to spin longer, right? That was when we first learned about the model for improvement and PDSAs. The model for improvement starts with 3 questions, which you can see here on your screen. And these are the 3 questions. They should look familiar to you that you've been answering as you set up your PDSA testing in the dashboard. So when you go into the dashboard and start to build a PDSA, you start with these 3 questions. So first we ask, what are we trying to accomplish? And this is our aim. Then we ask, how will we know a change is an improvement? And we do that by measuring our change. We collect information to understand if the change is leading to improvement. And then the third question is, what change can we make that will result in improvement? And these are those specific ideas that you've been testing or that you're going to try out. So once you've identified a change idea as part of that third step, that's when you move into testing it using the plan, do, study, act cycle. And so here you can see an overview of the PDSA. So the first step is plan. All right. If you are messaging me in the chat to be moved to a different room, could you please message Kate Hamby-Hopkins at the top, and she'll move you. All right, so our first step is plan. And this is where you identify the who, what, when, and where of the test that you're going to try out. It's also essential that as part of your plan, you're developing a plan to collect data. That's how you're going to evaluate your test and know if it's leading to improvement and helping you ultimately reach your goal. And then finally, in the plan step, that's where we write down the question that you're trying to answer with the PDSA cycle, and then we set a prediction for what you think will happen. When we get to the do step, this is where you carry out your plan. So then you collect your data and you document what you observed as you put your plan into action. That third step, study, that's when you reconvene with your team. You review what you learned, you finish analyzing the data you collected, you summarize what you've learned about the change idea from your test, and then you compare your results to that prediction that you set as part of your plan, right? And we're going to come back to that prediction piece. And then finally, you have the act step, and that's where you decide what you're going to do next. So you could abandon a change idea once you have evidence that it's just not a good fit, it's not working. You might adapt a change idea when you want to continue testing with different people or under different conditions, making those small tweaks or changes along the way to improve the outcome. Or you might want to adopt a change. So we adopt a change idea once it's been fully tested through multiple PDSA cycles with a large group of people under many conditions, and you're really confident that it's working for you, right? At this stage, the change idea is ready to become part of your standard practice, so what everyone in your organization will do. All right, so one thing to note when we look at the PDSA cycle, this probably feels like a pretty typical way of doing things, right? You have an idea, you try it out, you see if it works, and then you respond, right? If it works, you keep it. If it doesn't work, you get rid of it. But what may feel less comfortable when you're new to improvement work is this idea of slowing down and deliberately completing each of the steps before you move on to the next step. So sometimes we can see teams get stuck in part of the PDSA cycle, right? So they might get stuck in this plan where they plan, but they never do, right? So that's one place where people often get stuck. Sometimes we see teams that just kind of cycle from plan to do to plan to do to plan to do, and they never take that pause where they really analyze the data and they make an informed decision about whether they're going to keep testing. So as you're thinking about doing your PDSA cycles, right, one of the things that we want you to come away with is that each of these steps is important to the process, right? Each carries equal weight, and you want to make sure you do each of the steps. All right. So let's jump in to our first tip. And this is the one that many of you said you've taken away from your first 3 months of testing now, right? Start small. So this is something you've been hearing a lot. You've clearly been seeing it in your own work. You've heard us talk about the power of one and the idea that when you're testing, when you first start testing a new change idea, you want to test it on the smallest scale possible. So you're thinking, what can I learn in one visit with one family by testing one change idea? And we start small because it's less risky. When you start small, it's easy to tweak and keep improving on your idea for the next test. You can think of it, as you see on the slide here, as like starting in pencil rather than in ink, right? So you haven't committed yourself because you don't yet know if this change is going to help you get where you want to go, right? You also, that way you haven't asked your whole team to commit to a new way of doing things when it may turn out not to work at all. So because we're focused on rapid testing and starting small, we do expect that you'll abandon many ideas along the way, right? So you can learn just as much from those tests that don't work out as you expected as from the ones that do. All right. So we're going to do a little test here of your own CQI coaching skills. So we have a plan, and we took this plan from a previous cohort of the coin. And you can see that this team's plan is to use Healthy Moms, Happy Babies cards to facilitate discussion of healthy relationships. And in this case, the parent educators are going to test this with families who have visits in the next 2 weeks. So this test is going to occur, let's say, between July and August, July 23rd and August 6th. This will be tested during virtual home visits, and the team is going to have copies of cards that they pass out to all the home visitors and a questionnaire to gather feedback from the families. So as we think about that first tip that we just talked through, what advice would you give this team?
It looks like the whole program is going to try to implement this all at once instead of one parent educator with one family.
Yes, so your advice would be, let's try this with one parent educator and one family. And I'm seeing that in the chat box as well. Great. Start with one family. Start with giving one family a card, or one home visitor gives two families 2 different cards. Yep. All right, great advice.
Also, I think pretty much instead of having the families with visits in the next 2 weeks, shorten that, make it a shorter sample to obtain within an easier time frame.
Yeah, so does somebody have a home visit this afternoon where they could do this, or one tomorrow, right? What's the quickest that we can test this and get a little bit of learning? All right, I'm seeing a good point in the chat, more specifics about the type of feedback that will be gathered from families. Very good. All right, so let's move forward. So just as you said, right, thinking through how can I cut this plan in half? How can I make it shorter, more compact? So if you start with a plan and says, here's what I think I can accomplish in the next 2 months, what do you think you can accomplish in 1 month? What can you do in 2 weeks? And then that refrain that you'll often hear in quality improvement work is, what can you do by next Tuesday, right? What can you turn around as quickly as possible? And how can you learn?
Sarah, can I add a comment?
Absolutely.
So you guys are on fire. You're very much not basic PDSA people from how you started. And I just want to say this: cut it in half again, cut it in half until it can't be cut in half anymore is great for your first cycle, right? So I loved all the things in the chat about start with one family, be more specific about the feedback. And then when they come back, if it worked, if you're satisfied with the results, then maybe you double it, right? For the next cycle. If you're not satisfied with the results, then you tweak it and you try it again at the same scale. So this is a terrific tip for your first PDSA, and it can be applied backwards when you're starting to gain some momentum and you're ready to move on to your next cycle. That's just a little preview into ramps, which was the other room, because you're already ahead of the curve. Sorry, Sarah.
No problem. Absolutely. All right, so we're going to try one more knowledge check here. So here we have another plan. This team's test is going to be creating a breastfeeding home visitor toolkit to support discussion of the benefits of breastfeeding. So that toolkit's going to include some copies of educational handouts, benefits of breastfeeding cards, video and app links, models for demonstrating a good latch, and a breast pump. So one home visitor is going to take this toolkit and to a home visit with one family. It's going to be an outdoor visit scheduled for June 18th. And this team's going to buy and print all the materials that they need and assemble the toolkit before they go. So what advice would you give to this team as you're thinking about the scale of their test?
I would just focus on one item before utilizing all of that. I think that's way too much and it just be too complicated. You just want to keep them engaged in the conversation, and you'll lose them with all that information. So like really narrow it down to like maybe one copy of an educational handout, and then go with one home visitor with one family on one visit. And then, you know, if they utilized it and they want to, they obtain that goal, then they can either adopt it, adapt it, or abandon it. And then next time, for the next, you know, continuation within that primary driver, they can go to the next thing, maybe cards, and then break that down as well. Because if it's way too many ideas, it just gets very confusing.
Right on, exactly right. Right, we want to, for this first test that this team's going to do, we want to scope this down to focus in on one change idea, right? And then you're going to use your multiple PDSA cycles to build your way into your final resource or your final product or your final sort of idea, right? So you can think of doing many PDSA cycles about these different potential resources that would go into this toolkit. And you would have learning about each of those separately, right? I'm just checking the chat. And it looks, yeah, yep, you're all on the same you're all on the right track here, right? So you want to think about a smaller idea to start. Okay, so really good on the start small concept. Our next tip that we're going to spend some time on is task versus test. Has anyone heard of this before as it relates to PDSA? All right. Okay, so this one might be new to folks. So when you're designing your PDSA, right, one thing that you want to be mindful of is that what you're designing is a test and not a task. So a test, which you can see over on the right side of your screen, answers a specific question. It uses a theory and a prediction. It helps you build knowledge over multiple cycles. And it's something that you can try out over a number of different conditions. So to contrast that, a task is something that needs to get done or that you need to complete, usually before the actual test can happen. So a task might be brainstorming, it might be collecting data or building a data collection instrument. It might be training people on the test that you're going to run, or holding a team meeting to help you decide what's going to happen and when. So all of those are tasks. They're things that you will need to complete in order to get through your PDSA cycle, but they're not part of the actual test itself. So we're going to look at some examples, but when you look at your dashboard and you fill out your PDSAs, right, one of the things that you'll see is this field for tasks that are required for your test, right? So there's a place where you can note all that work that needs to happen beforehand, but the idea, what you're actually testing, what you're building is a test of an actual change idea. So we'll look at a non-home visiting example first, and then we'll go into some home visiting examples. So let's say that I want to increase my daily intake of water to 64 ounces by the end of July. Some of the tasks that I'm going to need to complete, I'm going to need to buy a water bottle. I'm going to need to measure how much water I currently drink in a day. And I might want to research some good ideas that other people have. But then when it comes to the actual tests I'm going to run, what are the changes that I'm going to test? Some of those might be scheduling an hourly alarm. So if my phone rings on the hour and tells me to take a drink, will that help me remember to drink more water throughout the day? I might also try mixing it up and adding some cucumber or lemon to my water to make it taste more appealing. And will that help me to drink more water? So can you see the difference here between those tasks, those things we need to do, and then the idea that we're actually going to test out to help us reach our goal? All right. So let's go into a home visiting example. And I'm going to ask you to weigh in using the chat to let me know whether this strikes you as a task or a test. So here the team, what are they trying to accomplish? They aim to survey 90% of home visitors to assess their current knowledge of the ASQ policy in their organization. How will they know a change is an improvement? If home visitors complete the survey and turn it in, we will be able to assess their knowledge of the policy. What's the change that we can make that will result in improvement? The team's going to administer an electronic survey assessing the knowledge of the current policy, including when is the appropriate time frame to complete ASQs, what to do when there's a score in the gray or black, the home visitor's satisfaction with their ASQ training, and then their confidence in communicating results to families. So the question this team is trying to answer, if we survey home visitors on the current policy, will it result in understanding where home visitors do not feel comfortable and need additional support or training? And their prediction is that not everyone's going to complete the survey. The home visitors will report not feeling comfortable reporting negative results to families and will not be familiar with the referral process. All right, so I am seeing a number of people who have weighed in using the chat. And so far, everyone has selected test. Do we have anyone who wants to go against the grain and make the case that this is a task rather than a test? Mary Catherine, do you want to?
Yeah, I'll jump off that diving board. Oh, we've got someone else though. Miss Joy
Okay.
would like to make the case that it's a
Great.
task. Let's hear from Joy first, and then I'll back you up, Miss Joy.
It's a task. It's all a task. I feel like if you change the task, maybe you'll have a better result instead of just trying to make a test. I don't know. Back me up, Mary Catherine.
All right. I think this is like buying a water bottle. This is gathering information in order to do something in the future, but I'm not testing a change to the policy or testing a change to education. Like if what I want to accomplish is that my home visitors are familiar with the policy and comfortable with it, I have to do something other than ask them how they feel currently. So to me, this is a task because we're only gathering information. It's gonna prepare us to do a good test of some change, but we haven't changed anything yet. We've just gathered information. Like when I buy my water bottle, I haven't actually drunk any more water, right? And I haven't changed any of my habits. I've just bought something to set myself up for success.
Yeah, exactly. That's the key here, right? When you read this, there's not an actual change that's happened that the team is evaluating, right? So they're gathering information. And like Mary Catherine said, right, this is good information that's going to then help this team form a test, right? So they might get information that says the home visitors don't feel comfortable reporting negative results. And so the test then might be some role-playing exercises around reporting negative results, right? Or it might be a script that home visitors could test out using in that instance. But just gathering this information is the task that's setting us up for the test. And I think what we have here, you can then think about how this team could then revamp this idea into a test. So here, what is the team trying to accomplish? They want 100% of home visitors to feel comfortable explaining, scoring, referring, and sharing results with families when completing the ASQ. How are they going to know a change is an improvement? They're going to use the results of a 7-question pre and post survey of knowledge and comfort with the ASQ screening policy. What change are they going to make? So this is the part that's different, right? They're going to provide an 1.5 hour refresher training to all home visitors on the policy, protocol, administration, and communication of results. So if they provide that refresher training, will it result in all home visitors reporting that they are familiar with the policy, adequately trained, know the referral process, and are comfortable discussing results with families, right? So you can see how they took that idea of surveying the home visitors to, yep, we're going to do that as a pre-survey, but then we're going to introduce this change idea, this refresher training. And then we're going to collect some additional data during or after that refresher training to see if we've accomplished what we had hoped. All right. I'm just looking at the time. I think I'm gonna skip over this next one, Mary Catherine, and I'm gonna hand it over to you for a time. So.
All righty. So let me start here. Great. So we are moving on to tip 3. So the first half of this session is about 3 quick tips. The third one is make your predictions specific. Specific predictions help us avoid hindsight bias. So if I say, I predict that tomorrow it will rain from 9 to 10, then it'll either rain from 9 to 10 or not. But if I say, I predict that tomorrow the weather will be lousy, tomorrow when it's a little foggy, I might say, no, the weather was lousy, right? And I guessed that I was right. So the more specific you are with your prediction, the better set up you are to learn from what actually happened. We want to include multiple perspectives from the team. One of my favorite things about PDSAs is we don't have to negotiate an agreement. We can all disagree about what's going to happen and then test it and see what happens. So if somebody predicts that the wording is going to work well one way and somebody predicts that there's better wording for that introductory script, you can test 2 scripts in parallel, or you can test one and predict different things. So include multiple perspectives and make sure your plan is set up to collect the data needed to evaluate your predictions. So how could you strengthen this prediction and the data collection plan to ensure we know whether our prediction was met or not met? This is a PDSA to create an individualized infant feeding plans to support families to meet infant feeding goals. One home visitor, Angela, was going to do this with 1 client over the next 2 home visits in that 2-week period. The task or tool was a copy of the infant feeding plan template, the list of community supports, and breastfeeding in the first hour handout. And the prediction is that we believe that infant feeding plans will help families feel better supported in making decisions about breastfeeding and more aware of resources available in the community. So, how could you strengthen this prediction? Now it's getting juicy. Nobody knows. So let's go back. Specific predictions with multiple perspectives and a data plan to collect on it. So we believe infant feeding plans will help families feel better supported in making decisions. And the data is, was the infant feeding plan completed? Does the mother intend to breastfeed? And qualitative feedback from the home visitor. Any thoughts? How would you strengthen this prediction? Thank you. Morgan Sowers says, narrow the focus of the what. So the what is this big infant feeding toolkit, right? So that's good. And I think that that gets back to tip number 1, which is keep it small, right? You say, cut that feeding plan in half, cut the feeding plan in half again, and cut it in half again. But let's focus for now on the prediction. We're going to test whatever it is with 1 home visitor and 1 client over 2 visits. But our prediction isn't about 1 client over the next 2 weeks. Sarah, what do you think?
Yeah, I will jump in. So what I would do is, if I'm the home visitor who's going to test this, I'm going to think about who that client is that I'm testing this with and everything I know about her and what we've already talked about. And I'm going to think about how an infant feeding plan might work with me and that client doing this together, right? So is this a mom who I know often when we start a visit, there's a number of things on her list that she wants to get through, and we're usually a little short on time for things that might be on my list. So I might predict that it's going to take a few home visits to get through the plan with her. Or I might predict that, you know, I've heard this mom talk a lot about breastfeeding. I think this will be a really exciting piece for her, and she'll want to get more information about the resources in her community.
Good, yeah. And Kimberly Pierce added, make a prediction about that one family. Kimberly, can you say more? What might you predict for one family using this?
I was just thinking maybe that one specific family will, their infant feeding plans will help them better support them in making a decision, as opposed to, we believe that the infant feeding plans will help families, maybe changing the wording of that statement to be specifically to that one family.
Perfect. Yeah. And then you'll know after you use it with that family if it happened or didn't happen. Because you won't know if it's happening for families in general, but you'll know having tested it with this one family. And that gets a little bit back to what one of your colleagues said earlier, which is you're going to probably have to pick a piece of the infant feeding plan first, right? So if we just use infant feeding goals and try that over 2 visits, we'll learn something about that one family. So I might make a prediction. If I focus on the infant feeding goals, this family will successfully identify 2 to 3 goals in the first 2 home visits that we apply this. And the data collection plan would be about the goals that were set. So after those 2 meetings, I would be able to say, wow, she didn't successfully make 2 to 3 infant feeding goals. Maybe she wasn't ready for that. Maybe we had to start with education around skin to skin rooming in pacifiers, right? And I'd test something different. If she did get those 2 to 3 infant feeding goals defined, but one of them was, I aspire to never breastfeed my child, then I might want to regroup and test something different in the next 2 visits, right? All right, good.
And there was also a great comment in the chat about feeling better supported is hard to measure, and thinking, what does that mean, right? How can you make that more specific and measurable?
Perfect. Great. I mean, one of the only ways to measure that is to ask, did this particular tool help you to feel better supported? But unless you're going to tie it to exactly what you're testing and ask it exactly in that way, it is really hard to measure that, right? All right. So I want everybody to stand up for a second. I'm standing up already, but just stand up for a second. We're going to do a little bit of head, shoulders, knees and toes, knees and toes. Head, shoulders, knees and toes, knees and toes. Eyes and ears. Stretch a tiny bit. And mouth and nose. So I coach 4-year-old soccer on Saturday, and that's our warm-up. But we're at a transition point. We've got about 10 minutes left, and we're going to hit you with something that really bridges PDSAs 101 and PDSAs 201. All right, so this is a little bit more intense. If you're at capacity, you're maxed out, take a deep breath. It's going to be over in 10 minutes. If you're still all on, then lean in because this will be helpful. All right. Thank you, Tracy Marshall, for singing back at me in the chat. Otherwise, I get all embarrassed. Okay. So maximizing learning from PDSAs. The whole point of doing PDSAs is to facilitate rapid learning, right? And this is a rubric that was created by someone just like you on one of the first quality improvement teams that I worked with. These were preschool teachers in Chile, a little bit of a different context. But she had also never done PDSA testing before. And she said, you know, this rubric helps me understand if I have designed my test in a way that's going to help me learn, or if I'm setting myself up to kind of churn through these cycles and document things, but not learn as much. This is useful for the CQI teams at the LIA level. So many of you to reflect and strengthen your PDSAs. It's not a grading tool. It's just a way to know, like, did I get the things that I need in order to learn fastest? And the idea is to aim for a progression, not perfection on this. So this isn't a report card. It's just something that helps us make sure we're thinking through PDSAs and getting the pieces. For awardee coaches, this is also really helpful to see where teams have strengths and where they need a little bit more support, and guiding the review and the feedback. The way it's built is the first column on the left shows the key components of PDSA cycles. And then it just has these very loose buckets, 1, 2, 3, and 4. 4 is most complete, 1 is least complete. So the first component is that the PDSA cycle is clearly related to the aim of the cycle. And there were a bunch of examples in those that we just saw that said things like, we want to, the example Sarah showed about the ASQ, where the task was assessing the home visitor's knowledge of the policy and the comfort. And then the next round where she redrafted it and made it a test of, we want 100% of the home visitors to have comfort with their policies. This is dealing with that. The PDSA should be directly tied to an aim and to the driver diagram. A notation of 1 means it's completely unrelated. And the notation of 4 is that the PDSA cycle is completely related with the aim and it's directly linked to the driver diagram. This helps us know that what we're testing is going to help us get to our ultimate goal. The second component is that the PDSA report includes a clear objective, prediction, and indicator. The indicator is the measure. A rating of 1 means you don't have an objective, you don't have a prediction, and you don't have a measure. And a rating of 4 means you've got all 3 of these. The third component is that the steps of the PDSA cycle itself are sequential and related. So what's in your plan is related to what you do, which is also in your study, right? So that measure of like, I'm going to measure if somebody is more comfortable in a study might not tie to what you've done, but it should. So there's no relationship between those. There's a partial relationship between the plan, the do, the study, and the act. There's a relationship with each of them, or there's a relationship that's described specifically. The next component is that there are consecutive PDSA cycles conducted for the same change idea with sequential cycles building on what you learned in the earlier cycles. So this is where we jump into ramps, right? So we said for your first PDSA cycle, cut it in half till it can't be cut in half anymore. But if you do that first test of infant breastfeeding goals with 1 infant and 1 home visitor over 2 weeks, and it goes great, then the next cycle could be, there are 2 or more cycles done for the change idea. And what we learned in the first one is or is not related to what we did in the second one. For the category of 4 here, there are 3 or more cycles done for the same change idea. And there's a relationship between the learning in the first and the plan and the do in the next cycle for each one. And then the last thing is the scale of the PDSA, that it's appropriate. So for the first set, the first cycle, it's often going to be 1 home visitor, 1 family, as small as you can get. But as you learn, appropriate's going to change, right? So if I went from 1 family to 2 families to 4 families to 6 families, then that's probably appropriate. If I went from 1 family to every family in the program, that's inappropriate. Again, this is an art, it's not a science. But the idea is that these categories, these key components, help us recognize and think through our design of our PDSAs so that we can learn as much as we can, as fast as we can. We're going to do a little exercise here where we go through and ask you to assess a PDSA cycle that's planned already across these 3 categories. We're not going to do all 5. So what I'd like you to think about here is, does this PDSA include a clear objective, prediction, and indicator? And I want you to use, up at the top of your screen, you will have a button that says annotate. And if you click on the annotate, you can choose to draw. And if you choose to draw, you can choose a circle. And then you'll just circle whichever one you want. That's my circle, but you all will have a circle. So
you'll need to go to view options. There's like a view options drop down, and then you can select annotate from there.
if this is all too complicated, you can put it in the chat. So does this have a clear objective, prediction, and indicator? I'll give you guys 90 seconds to work through this. The predictions at the bottom.